Milton Friedman published Capitalism and Freedom in 1962. Many policy ideas he espoused then struck critics as outlandish, unworkable, or unwise, or maybe all three. But some of his ideas were later adopted. For example, the idea of an all-volunteer American military force has now held for half a century. Friedman devoted a full chapter of Capitalism and Freedom to occupational licensing. He and many other economists argue that licensing reduces supply, limits competition, raises prices, and harms consumers, benefiting incumbent practitioners at the public's expense. Yet in this area, Friedman's ideas failed to gain traction. In fact, licensing has expanded a great deal in the past 60 years, and licensing requirements have become more onerous in many occupations. That raises some questions. How does occupational licensing work in practice? Why is it spread and resisted reform or rollback? Do we really need occupational licensing? And if so, how can we fix it? Welcome to the first episode of Economics Applied in 2026. I'm Stephen Davis, Senior Fellow and Director of Research at the Hoover Institution. Our guest today is Rebecca Allensworth. She is the David Daniels Allen Distinguished Chair of Law at Vanderbilt University Law School, where she studies antitrust and professional licensing. She earned a JD at Harvard Law School, serving as articles editor for the Harvard Law Review. She clerked for Judge Richard Posner of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit and went on and continues to have a distinguished academic career. Her work has been cited by the U.S. Supreme Court. She's testified before Congress and has advised 3 U.S. presidential administrations. Welcome so much, Rebecca. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
We are thrilled to have you. So you are the author of a recent book titled The Licensing Racket: How We Decide Who is Allowed to Work and Why It Goes Wrong. And a lot does go wrong, as you will tell us about. But let's start with the basics. Give us your definition of occupational licensing.
Yeah, so the definition that I use is a little bit different from ones that economists have used. So I actually call it professional licensing to highlight the difference. So professional licensing, by my definition, is the regime where you have to have state permission to work, and that is obtained only after significant investment in human capital. So we're talking about education that's measured in months, usually years, usually an exam, and other kind of fitness and character requirements. So this is a little bit distinct from what other economists use, which is any sort of state required permission to do a job. That might just be a CPR course over a weekend or,
Okay.
more limited.
But just, I want to make it clear. So if to become a florist in a certain state, I've got to do many hours of study, pass a course, work as somebody's apprentice for a while, that would count under your definition. Am I
That would
right?
count under my definition,
Okay.
exactly. So the use
Okay.
of the word occupational, I think, is used to show that this form of licensure has really expanded beyond what we think of as the, learned professions. And that's true, even of the kind of regulation that the book is about, because I saw, so auctioneers are a good example, alarm system installers. They require significant investment in human capital to really get a license, so it's the same category of regulation.
Yeah, and that's a key point. And I wrote down a little example of myself. There's examples like that. The Institute for Justice, which you talk about, and which is pushed back against licensing in many occupations, makes the point in one of its studies that in many states it's more onerous to get your cosmetology license than it is to become an emergency medical technician. So
That's
suggesting there's
right.
something other than just actual human capital development required to meet
Yeah.
these qualifications.
Yeah, I mean, hair is the big one. Hair is the really big one. It's actually one of the oldest professions. And so it has kind of grown over the years the way that the professions do when they're licensed, as I show in the book. And I'll give you another statistic that I like to share, even better, I think, than the EMT one. It takes more hours to become a barber or a cosmetologist, classroom hours, than the hours in law school. So
Okay.
it's really a huge investment. And, for a profession that's not going to be very high earning and for a profession that doesn't seem as sort of complicated or
Yeah,
safety sensitive.
exactly. And that
Yeah.
just like I have one little quibble about your definition, which is a lot of what a lot of the hoops that people are required to jump through with some of these occupations are not really augmenting their human capital. So
Yeah,
I
I see what you're saying.
yeah,
Right. So
so
maybe I should say ostensible
yeah,
investment
exactly,
in
exactly.
capital. Yeah. Okay. I see. I take your point. Friendly amendment. Yeah.
Exactly. But okay, so and what do the numbers look like now and how have they changed over time?
Yeah, so even with my more sort of restrictive definition of professional licensing, you're still looking at nearly 20% of the American workforce, 1 in 5 workers. That translates to about 30 million American workers. That makes it a more important regulation than unions, than certainly than the minimum wage. I argue that
Yeah.
it is the most important regulatory institution we have for labor today.
Yeah. Okay. And I think you can make a pretty good case for that. And this by the way, this is hundreds of occupations. And each occupation, this differs across states. I'm not saying every state has hundreds of different occupational licensing requirement standards, but they differ across states. What's defined as a occupation requiring licensure, the requirements themselves, and so on. And the reason I'm emphasizing this point is it's not like you can get some generic uh, qualification that says you are a competent, good worker. No, you've got, if you want to do this little narrow thing in some states, you got to get a license. And by the way, if you move to another state, you got to go through the hoops again in many cases.
That's right. And so I think I added them all up, and according to my definition, there's 300 licensed occupations that are licensed in at least one state. And you can figure as sort of a back of the envelope calculation, any given state's going to have about 30 to 50 licensed occupations. And many of them are overlapping, nurses, lawyers, doctors. But then every state's got its own little, handful of professions that it licenses that are maybe not licensed in other states. And this means that, if you work in one of those professions in one state that's unlicensed, you cannot transfer to the other state without, getting a whole new license. And even if you have a license in one state and you want to go to another licensed state, there's nothing saying they'll have the same requirements or that you can
Right.
easily transfer your license. So there's a real mobility problem here too.
There is. And I think that's underappreciated. You do have a chapter in the book about uh, how these mobility barriers were a problem during the COVID-19 pandemic for medical personnel, getting the medical personnel to practice in the states that were most affected by the pandemic at any one point in time. But more generally, it inhibits the ability of people and the economy to respond to shocks that might lead to people moving. And it could be an economic shock, like one part of the country has become depressed and job opportunities are more plentiful than another, or it could become just an individual level thing, like my spouse got a fabulous job in another state, but if I move to that other state, I've got to go through all my occupational licensing requirements again. So it inhibits the ability of people to pursue their own livelihoods as individuals and as part of a household.
Yeah, and I think, part of that chapter was to point out the difficulty of mobility, but then to also point out that mobility is just one small part of a larger problem, which is that state by state licensing makes the professions less reactive to new demand. It's very hard to turn a workforce on a dime when demand increases, demand changes, and this goes not just for increase in demand for a particular kind of service, but also innovation in how you perform that
Right.
service or how you might deliver it. So the whole thing's very ossified as a result of this.
Yeah. So the innovation point's a good one. Give us an example of that to bring that home, because I don't think that's That's a point that I don't usually see emphasized in this context, but I think you're right.
So I think the familiar examples would be stuff like telemedicine, other ways that we understand, we hear about and we think about ways that we could be consuming services better, faster, cheaper across state lines. But it's happened in little ways too that I actually observed when I went to these licensing board meetings. So I saw it was the veterinary board shut down a new business idea by some technicians. So the veterinary technician is a lower level license you can get from the veterinary board, and importantly, you must be supervised on site by a veterinarian. Well, the veterinarians on the board shut down this idea that these techs had for pet sitting services. They were saying, we'll come to your home, we'll do the complicated meds, we'll do the subcutaneous fluids that the owners were doing for their pets. This was not like, something that was beyond the scope of what a regular person could do. They
Right.
just wanted to give them peace of mind. And this seemed like a great innovation, you could call it. I certainly would have used this when I had a sick dog and I was, traveling. But the licensed members of the veterinary profession shut it down at the board level because it was, relaxing those requirements.
So, okay, so a classic example of turf protection.
Yeah.
So,
And they have no incentive to do otherwise, right?
yes,
They don't have
we'll
to
we'll
pay the
come back.
cost.
We'll come back to that point
Yeah.
because your book's very good on explaining why it is with the system we have, we get the bad outcomes that we do. But I just wanted to put one more kind of piece of background, factual background on the table. Give us a sense of how licensing has expanded over time in the United States in terms of both its scope, but also the intensity of the requirements.
Yeah, so the first licensed profession, sort of classic licensed profession, was medicine, and law followed not long behind, and then really hair. That was kind of the next one. Dentists and hair, barbers and dentists were sort of a similar license. And then things were relatively steady for a while in terms of the scope of licensing. And then in the 70s, as economist Morris Kleiner has really documented, in the 70s, it really started to expand as an intervention. And most of the time, it was the professions themselves asking for the licensure status. And so that's when it really grew. And there's a graphic that everybody points to who worries about these issues about that shows over time from 1950 to the present the movement of people who are in trade unions goes down in this sort of like dramatic downhill slope, and then going uphill in the opposite direction and to the same degree is licensing. So it really has just since the 70s really taken off. And
Yeah. So the statistics I've seen using a somewhat more expansive definition of licensing than yours says that in the early decades after World War II, maybe 5% of the American workforce was covered by licensing requirements. And now it's 20% by your definition, and it's closer to 30%, I think, by some other definitions. So there's been this huge expansion in the scope of licensing. And what about the onerous nature of these requirements? And can you give us a sense of, or at least an example of how that's changed over time?
yeah, there's been great empirical work in this recent empirical work on this question. And the answer is if you give licensure to a profession, it will over time expand its onerousness. So the biggest one is years of education and kind of education, but also exams and continuing education are good examples of how this is done. So to give you an example, I saw a board that had gone from the 90s requiring about 1,500 hours of supervised therapy. This is for drug and alcohol abuse counselors.
Hmm.
1,500 hours. Then they went back and changed that to 3,000. By the time I was watching them, it was 6,000, which is, by the way, a 3-year medical residency for a
Right.
physician. So there's just kind of this is the chapter about this is called the ratchet because over time these requirements tend to really grow and grow and grow. And that's why
Right.
I brought up hair because hair has been around for a long time. They've been working the ratchet for a very long time.
Yeah. And so this is this example you gave, and it's true across more broadly, as part of how the supply restriction that Friedman had in mind that I mentioned in my opening remarks. It's not just that there's limits to competition after somebody becomes licensed in one of these occupations, but a big part of how these licensure requirements function is to inhibit entry, and so you limit the supply, and so that by itself, even in a competitive marketplace, if you were to limit supply, you're going to get higher prices. Okay. Aside from any other impediments to competition or innovation, going back to your earlier examples.
Yeah, so I think you're right to split it into two different effects. One is the limitation on supply tends to raise prices and limit innovation. And then the rules on what you can do once you're licensed. For example, you can't go to somebody's house and give their pets, medicine. Or you can't do a lot of them are actually in-home issues. You can't do hair in somebody's home. Those also will tend to raise price or at least decrease, quality
Mhm.
services or kinds of services.
Right. Okay, so we should let's get to the question, well, do we need occupational licensing? And if so, when and why? Make
Yeah,
make the case for it for a minute, and then we can talk about that.
right. So we've been talking so far about how, kind of terrible a lot of this can be, but I'm actually one of the few people who both thinks that professional licensing as we do it in the US is terrible and totally broken, and am willing to defend it in the abstract, just not the way that we do it. So I do think that there are good reasons to use something like professional licensing where you have real potential for public harm. And an economist would say, that's going to be present wherever you have externalities or you have information asymmetries. So people don't know what they're getting. It's good to have a baseline. You've passed the test. We know you're not going to be awful at this. That satisfies the information asymmetry issues. And externalities, you don't want to have doctors out there, performing dangerous type medical practice because that's actually going to sort of reverberate beyond the patient and the doctor relationship.
Let's take those two arguments separately because I think they have different strengths and weaknesses. So I think the stronger argument, in my view, you can tell me if you disagree, is about externalities in some occupations. So the example that I would give, if you have a doctor who fails to diagnose a highly contagious disease and gives somebody aspirin, says go sleep it off, come, call me next week if you're not better, and that person goes off and infects many others. Well, that's an externality beyond that patient doctor relationship, and we would like to ensure that that kind of thing doesn't happen or doesn't happen very often, given the state of medical knowledge. So that seems like a reasonable case to require a certain level of proficiency in occupations that give rise to that kind of externality. The information asymmetry argument, I think, is weaker because you can argue that certification, especially government sanctioned certification, can play at least as productive a role in addressing the information asymmetry as licensing. And by certification, I mean you don't need a license to practice in a certain occupation, but you have to make it clear to your customers, to your patients, to your clients, whether or not you've met certain certification standards. And those certification standards can be blessed by the government or it can be private certification. There's pros and cons to both of those. So I admit you don't talk a lot about this in the book unless I missed that part. Um, but in many occupations, it seems like certification could work as well or better than, well, certainly than licensing as it's practiced now in the United States, but even perhaps better than the kind of licensing regime that you would prefer to see. I wanted to get your reaction to that.
All right, so let me agree and disagree at the same time. And let me give you an example. So, court reporters, these are people who write down what's said, not just in court, because that's what it sounds like, but also depositions. This is a great example of a licensed profession in my state that suffers from potentially an information asymmetry problem that I think would be well solved by what you're identifying, right? Some sort of certification. And that's because the people who hire court reporters, courts, A, and B, lawyers, are sophisticated consumers. And they may want the cheapo person who's going to have some typos and they're going to pay less, and that's their choice. Or they could go ahead and get the state certified, certified, not licensed, or privately certified court reporter, and they have a little bit more of an assurance that they've gone to school and they're going to be a little bit better. I am totally on board for that. But the reason why I want to defend, though, and disagree with what you're saying on some level is because I believe, and maybe the economists listening to this podcast disagree, but I believe in paternalistic regulation, right? So I'm just going to come out and say that. So seatbelt laws, right, are fine with me. I do think it is appropriate to protect people from themselves sometimes. And that's why
Yeah.
when we're talking about doctors, even if the misdiagnosis isn't contagious, there's no externality. It's just the guy makes a bad choice by going to a bad doctor and he has a bad outcome.
So two things here. One,
There's
that's
nothing
still a
wrong with
problem.
regulating
That's
that.
still a problem.
No problem.
All the doctors out there are licensed, but I worry every time I pick one about picking the bad apple. But let me give a different example that I think makes your argument most. I like the court reporter example. I think it's excellent for an excellent example of where certification. It's not just that these are informed users of the court reporter service, but they're in a repeat relationship. It's a
Yeah.
repeat game.
Yeah.
So here's where I'd like to see licensing. The emergency medical technician in the ambulance who comes to my house if I have a heart attack. And I'm not in any position at that point to say, well, let me check out your certifications and
Right.
see if I like them. Or no, I'm going to call a different ambulance because I don't really trust that certification service. I want a different one. Okay, that in that case, I'm on board with I want licensing rather than certification. So maybe these two examples kind of cover the extremes, and you and I might draw the line in a slightly different place on where between certification and licensing, but at least it sounds like in principle we're not really all that far apart.
That's right. I think you're highlighting the idea of choice. And I think we can sort of define choice as, is it thrust upon you, like the EMT, or do you have the information to make an informed choice? But you're right, the question is really choice. And one thing I want to highlight is that it's easy for us to think, we are sophisticated consumers. I'm imagining you are a sophisticated consumer of
No,
service. Well,
sometimes,
I mean,
sometimes not.
we just by virtue of our position in life, we go to like the hospitals that are certified. I don't think you probably go to a local rural cash clinic for your services. I don't think that you're, for example, incarcerated and have to take the defender who comes through the door. So there's a lot of people who, just by virtue of their place in society, have a lot fewer choices about the professional services they consume. And I worry about them too, but I will say not as much as defenders of licensing as the status quo do. They use that, they wave that flag as a reason to have extreme
Yeah,
licensure.
they wave the flag. That's right.
They
I'm not
wave,
sure they're really so worried about it at all. They wave the
right.
flag. And you make
Yeah.
this very clear in your book. There's a big difference between the rhetoric that surrounds licensing, especially when these licensing boards are first created, and the way they operate in practice. So tell us how they operate in practice. I mean, this is a big part of your book and your larger body of work, as I understand it, is you do much more so than any economist that I've seen, get into the details of how it actually works on the ground. So tell us about that. We don't can't cover all
Yeah.
of this, but give us some of the highlights.
Well, I want to talk a bit about my methodology because that's what I think is so different about this book is instead of looking up databases and looking up data, which I did for my writings previously about licensing, I just went to licensing board meetings. I went to dozens of meetings here in Nashville. The state capital, so we had all the licensing board meetings happening. And I just sat there and took notes. I attended the medical board meeting the most, but I also went to a lot of hair meetings and, dozens of professions, dozens of meetings to learn how, like, what happens when we give regulation over to industry itself. Because my previous research had revealed that that's the case, that these licensing boards are primarily staffed by volunteers, part-time, they're fully professionalized, working in their profession, and then they sit on the board a few days a quarter and do this work. Like, what happens when we hand over regulation to self-regulation in that way? And the answer was like actually scarier and worse than I thought it would be, especially in the medical profession. But essentially, the professional interests as a sort of affect almost. Not they're not thinking there with dollars sitting there thinking with dollars and cents in their eyes and thinking about how this is going to make me richer, but they are thinking about things from the professional perspective. And that's both to do with the kind of barriers and the competition that we've been talking about, but also in the way that they handle wayward providers.
So I like this part of your research a lot, but nothing in that would surprise, nothing that you found in that regard would surprise Milton Friedman or George Stigler and his theory of regulation or so on. So you are what you can tell me if you disagree. What you do is you get into the nuts and bolts of how the licensing works on the ground and why, in some respects, it's maybe even worse than Friedman might have articulated. But the idea that if you give people authority to regulate an area where their self-interest is very much affected by the decisions they make, they will make decisions in their interest. That's no surprise. That will come as no surprise to a Friedman or Stigler or to many other economists. That there, there are sadly, a lot of my fellow economist colleagues cling to this myth of the benevolent regulator. But the Chicago school, and I spent most of my career at Chicago, wouldn't fall victim to that kind of rhetoric or viewpoint.
No, no, and nor would I. My day job is an antitrust professor.
Yes, I,
You
I
know,
noticed that.
I am very, very attuned to the idea that a cartel, which in fact is what I called these boards in previous writing,
Yes,
would regulate in their own interests. And I imagined this as, the things we've been talking about. So restricting supply, keeping prices high, keeping working conditions high, resisting things like home visits because they would, reduce maybe the happiness of the workers. Um, and I found a lot of that. I think that I was able to better observe the psychology behind what the Friedmans and the Stieglers were writing about, which was not about money. It was about prestige and esteem. So many of the reasons why they wanted to keep the barriers high was because they wanted it
yeah,
to be perceived as, I'm not saying that the economics and the money doesn't explain it. I mean, this is the age old argument about economics, right? So like, do people have to be thinking in terms of dollars and cents in order to engage in dollars and cents related behavior? No. What they
right.
were thinking about and what they were talking about was status and esteem. And so I thought that was very valuable and very interesting. I
Yeah,
think,
I think you're right. The psychology of it is not drawn to the fore in traditional economic analyses. But the way I like to think about it in this domain and many others is it's easy for a person to think along certain lines that will enhance their financial well-being. And it's
yeah.
harder for them to think along lines that presents risks or threats to their financial well-being. And that view is very evident. That characterization of what happens is very evident in some of the examples you give in your book.
Absolutely. And I will also say that there are entities here with a more systematic, more specifically financial interest at stake. And those are the associations. So the American Medical Association, the ABA, every profession has an association. And they're a little bit more, I think, clearly thinking about the economics of the thing. But still, the way that they message it to the individual board members and then the way that the board members message it to the public, it tends to be more about the ideas of esteem and prestige and of course, public protection. I mean, they talk a lot about public protection. I just didn't really see it in the way that they made their decisions.
Yeah, you have some great statistics on two kinds of actions that boards undertake: disciplinary actions and often arising from complaints from clients, customers, patients, and so on. And I forgot your term for it, but basically turf protection actions,
Mhm. Unlicensed,
unlicensed, unauthorized activity.
yeah.
So just tell us a little bit about that. This is about how what boards actually do on the ground and what they are responsive to and what they're not responsive to.
Yeah, so, for some of these professions that I was like, why is this licensed? I would ask members of the board and members of the profession, why is this licensed? And so, for example, for alarm system installers, they would say, well, you can have a lot of like people coming by and selling an old couple another system. They already have a system, just kind of fraud type stuff, scare tactics and whatever. Auctioneers, it was shill bidding and other fraud like misdescribing the items. Then I went to these meetings and I went to her disciplinary proceedings. And for every customer complaint that alleged one of these things, they would say, well, we're going to dismiss this. This is really more like a business problem, or, he said, she said. But anytime somebody said that they were auctioneering without a license or installing alarm systems without a license, they would throw the book. And so I got interested in this and actually read a year's worth of disciplinary decisions by a set of boards, not just those two, but including those two. And I learned that, like in some cases, they were 10 times more likely to act on the unlicensed practice. And usually, by the way, the complainants there were fellow licensed professionals, not consumers.
Mhm.
Like 10 times more likely to act on those complaints than on the very reason that the raison d'etre for the license, which is the consumer fraud or the other sort of illegal acts. Um, so that showed me that, like, yeah, the public protection obviously is not their priority if they're willing to poo-poo it so thoroughly at the disciplinary stage. Really, maybe this is about keeping the unwanted competitors out.
Right, exactly, exactly. So you you have quite a few ideas in the book about I would they come in many buckets. Some are you say we should just roll back licensing in some areas. In others, you say, well, there's things we could substitute for licensing. I think we ought to talk about an example like that. And then you also have some ideas for, well, in your view, there are certain occupations that should be licensed, but we need to reform the way boards work and even what constitutes a board. So
Yeah,
maybe you can take each of those in turn. What would you just roll back?
yeah.
What would you try to substitute some other form of regulation? You talk about premises inspections and so on. And then, where would you actually just stick with licensing, but do it very differently?
Yeah, and before we get to that, I do want to highlight one thing that I found that did surprise me, and I think maybe would have surprised Stigler and Milton Friedman, and that was what the higher esteemed profession boards did with discipline. And I think this is another example, just like the unlicensed practice enforcement, where you really saw that this is not about public protection. So I saw, especially the medical board, but the nursing board too, and the law boards keep in practice some of the worst of the worst. I mean, stories are in the book. I don't need to summarize them now, but stories that would really, really surprise me, surprise an average person, looking at what these boards are doing. And I think that is a little inconsistent with what Friedman might have said, because if you could kick somebody out of the profession, well, that's one less competitor. If you keep them in your profession, it makes the profession look bad. And this was, in fact, something that people told me. But that all seemed swamped by a different impulse, also coming from self-regulation, which was to kind of circle the wagons. And that was, I think, where identity and played played a very strong psychological role in what the boards did. So anyway, I just want to at least
Yeah,
flag
can I just elaborate on
that.
that? Because I think you're right. And yeah, you could interpret Friedman's arguments to encompass this, but it would be a strain. The way I interpret what happens is these people sitting on the boards making disciplinary decisions, they are in the same occupation. It's easy for them to identify with something like, oh, I'm a doctor. What if I happen to make a mistake and
Mhm.
I was booted out of the profession? So they may not have been likely to do something as egregious as the person who's before them, for the disciplinary proceeding. But the whole way the thing runs, they're kind of inclined to identify with the incumbent practitioner who's misbehaved or worse. As you give some examples of very bad behavior that are then, things like exchanging sexual favors with clients or patients, and giving them lots of drugs, which they can then resell on the open market or the black market, I should say. And yet, giving these people a second chance. So that's a
Yeah.
pretty egregious offense.
And
Um,
third and fourth chances. And here's another example where I think the associations were had a big role to play in messaging to the board members about going, using their leniency, using forgiveness, using second, third, and fourth chances. It's obvious how, to the profession in general, you'd want the disciplinary system to be pretty casual. So that was definitely what the associations wanted. But there was also an economic argument behind it, which I think is interesting, which was, hey, this doctor has $1.5 million worth of training. And to remove him from the profession does away with that investment, and it also deprives this whole area of their care. And so for access to care reasons, which is ultimately an economics question, we need to keep him in the practice. Now, this made very little sense to me, especially given how hostile they were to access to care arguments when it came to restrictions to enter the profession.
or immigrant doctors
Yeah.
or nurse practitioners expanding the scope of what they are allowed to do. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, getting to your question, what to do about this? So I do have some buckets I want to put professions in. And one bucket is this doesn't need to be licensed. This is what I think about court reporters. I think it's probably true about hair, although I think that there may be some regulation, not professional licensure, not, a year's worth of education. These are areas where the market more or less is going to protect consumers. The worst thing that could happen, a bad haircut, wouldn't seem to be the end of the world. And where access to these professions is really important for people who want to be entrepreneurs, want to just, get a job. Um, for things like hair, you could do something more straightforward and targeted at the actual risks. So to the extent that you think that hair cutting potentially spreads disease. And I want to emphasize that I do not know this to be true. This is just something that people tell me. Advocate for licensure. They say if you don't clean your instruments, you could spread disease. So let's take that at face value, which we shouldn't, by the way. We should demand evidence of all these things. But if we were to find that that's true, you could have a premises regulation. You could say you have to clean your instruments, you have to clean them in this way. And we'll come by and inspect once a month to make sure you're using
So, like what we do for restaurants.
like what we do for restaurants, which is an important comparison because actually, I would probably rather, I'm not going to say this. I would rather get what you might get in a hair salon than get the kind of thing you could get in a restaurant.
Yes,
You know what I mean? Okay.
exactly.
Like you could,
Anyone who's had food poisoning after eating at a restaurant, that's a serious risk, even
it's terrible.
in the regulated regime we live in.
Yeah. So and we have ways of dealing with that. We have rules about handling food, we have rules about just keeping things clean, and so we don't require licensure for people who work in a restaurant. Um, so I make this move to say professional licensing is appropriate only for professions for which you can't write a code. You can't say step by step, here's what you do. Tattoos would be a great example of something that is dangerous and clearly can spread disease, but that you can describe the specific steps you need to take to clean your instruments and to be a safe tattoo artist.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean we shouldn't regulate it, but we don't need the elaborate education and deep knowledge building that's required for what I call professional judgment, which is the application of a vast and complex set of knowledge to an individual case by case situation. So there's no code for how to defend a murder case. There's no set of steps for diagnosing cancer, specific steps that work every time. You have to have that elaborate education. So that's the line that I try to draw for professional licensing.
Okay, can't things that can't be reduced to kind of a formula that
Yeah,
applies broadly and that don't involve, like in the restaurant example, kind of a natural inspection verification regime. So that's what we
Exactly.
do with restaurants.
Right.
That's what we do with many things.
Yeah. And by
Okay.
the way, you have to have the information asymmetry and or the externalities problem too. So university professors, for example, would be an example of something that does require professional judgment, but it just doesn't fail the other, people know what they're getting when they hire a university professor. They do their due diligence, CEOs would be the same thing. You can have highly complex, difficult jobs that aren't appropriate for licensing.
Right. Right. Okay. So let's take the ones then that do meet your standard for some form of licensing is required. How would you fix the current system?
Well, I think the biggest problem is the boards. I think that the way that the statutes in the states delegate regulatory authority, which involves both rulemaking about how you enter and how you can practice, and discipline about when somebody has acted inappropriately, that's all given to this licensing board. That's both biased in the ways that we've talked about, but also really inexperienced and unknowledgeable in ways we haven't talked about. Because keep in mind, these guys they're great nurses, they're great doctors, but they don't understand regulation. They don't understand the big picture problems in their profession. They don't understand rural medicine. They don't understand access to care. The kinds of things that economists actually study and know very well. In some ways, there's other kinds of experts, mostly regulatory expertise, that bears on what we should be doing with licensing. So I think that we've got to get rid of the dominance of these boards. We can make the boards represent broader interests, broader degrees of expertise, and essentially house that decision-making authority, not with the private board, which I'd argue is basically a private cartel, but with government itself.
Okay. I think you give some examples. The contrast that sticks in my mind that you drew between cemeterians
Hmm.
and funeral directors. So, if I
Yeah.
recall correctly, funeral directors are typically licensed, at least in many states, perhaps all, I'm not sure. Cemeterians are not. They are regulated by, at least in maybe, I don't remember whether this was a universal example or a Tennessee example, um, regulated by a commission, a public commission.
Hmm.
So, there's still oversight of how people in that profession practice. But the oversight is by at least ostensibly disinterested public servant who can draw upon the kinds of regulatory expertise and sources of information you were alluding to earlier, rather than just a bunch of people in the same business deciding what they want to allow within the scope of their occupation and handling disciplinary matters. So you
That's
want
right.
to draw that out a bit?
Yeah, so they're actually, I would say they're both licensed in the sense that you cannot be a cemeterian. And by the way, I learned this word in my research. This is somebody who operates a cemetery, so buries people, and also typically does cremation, although I think those are different licenses. And then, takes money from you now for funeral services in the future and also commits to long-term upkeep of the grounds. So that's what a cemeterian does, and then a funeral director is, typically more involved in the preparation of the body. But the point is that they both involve some very similar consumer risks. They
Right.
both involve handling of bodies, and they both involve long-term commitments by, pay now and we'll perform later that create some, consumer protection problems. The cemeterians are done through, as you said, a program where basically a bureaucrat, in some ways, this book is in defense of bureaucrats, decides on the specifics of the rules, transparently and through the governmental process, and then initiates disciplinary proceedings against cremators and cemeteries. And then the other one is done by a board, which is dominated by funeral directors who've done the education, have done the whole thing. And actually, this is an example where I think that the funeral directors have really resisted innovation and change in the way we do death rituals and have really insisted on the elaborateness, the overhead, the viewing, the embalming of the bodies as like the real kind of funeral experience. And I think part of that is driven by licensure and demand for licensure. Meanwhile, I think people have said that's too expensive. I don't want to deal with a licensed professional. I don't want to deal with all this. I want to go to the simple cremation and burial. So in some ways, licensing is actually driven, I think, clients and consumers to the simpler one. But yes, the point is that I attribute, at least in part, the simpler, more straightforward, more economically reasonable regulation for cemeteries to the fact that they're regulated differently and not through a licensing board.
Right. So this example is an interesting one because it illustrates the potential for retaining licensure, but moving towards a very different regulatory approach, namely getting away from the boards that are totally dominated by people who are in the same business.
Yes, exactly. And it suggests that if you have more governmental accountability, you're going to have better and more reasonable regulation.
Okay. And you also have some discussion about the comparison between the US and the UK,
Mhm.
where the bureaucratic approach, let's call it, the is actually the prevailing approach, in complete contrast to the US, where the board approach, the own profession dominated board approach is much more common. So I mention these because the reforms you're pushing for where you want to retain licensing, they're not pie in the sky ideas. You can find examples of them in some occupations in some states in the United States, but they're also these alternative ideas are also the prevailing approach in our common law um, ancestor, I guess, the UK. So it's
Yeah.
it's not like these are somehow foreign to the US way or the American way of doing things.
That's right. I mean, there are best practices. I think I say that no state is doing it all perfectly, but some of them do it better than others. And what I like about the UK system is that everything from the way regulation is made for doctors and also the way discipline is administered, there's a real balance between physicians having a seat at the table and other actors having a seat at the table. And those other actors are not what they are in the US. So on all these boards, there's typically one, two, or three public members, but they have no qualifications. They too have not read the statutes. They too have not read the regs, and they are probably even more clueless about both the profession and regulation. I'm speaking in broad terms. This is not true about every last one, but
Sure.
this is the tendency. In the UK, half or more of the decision makers about professional regulation for doctors are not doctors, but they are paid for their work. They're trained in the statutes, they're trained in the aims of regulation, and they're like, it's, for lack of a better word, sort of a professionalized role for them. And I think that they get better results because they have more serious regulators making the decisions.
Okay, so one way to summarize part of your argument, maybe somewhat facetiously, is that yes, bureaucracies have lots of problems and they can get captured and so on. But the usual type of state and local bureaucratic apparatus is an improvement upon the way licensing boards operate,
Yeah,
and for good reasons.
I think the
That,
way I put it in one of my articles is that these boards are born captured. You don't have
yes,
to have
exactly,
these boards
exactly.
because they are just by their very fact
No,
are.
I like that way of putting it because there's a whole branch of economics associated with Stigler, but more broadly public choice theory in economics that says, look, even when regulation ostensibly pursues good goals, there's a risk of capture. And we want to try to design regulatory institutions to at least minimize the likelihood or the negative consequences of capture. And here, as you say, we have an instant, well, just gonna they're captured from the outset by design. So it's in that sense really a crazy way to regulate a profession.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, this was evidenced also by the fact that I would see the board doing something, trying to make a decision, and then somebody in the audience would pop up and say, "Hi, I'm a member of the association. We're happy to do this for you as a special task force. Would you like us to take over the rulemaking revision here?" And the
Yes.
board would say, "Oh yeah, oh that would save us a lot of time and work. And hey, I'm busy. I get back to my practice." And that was just not something I think you would see happen quite so nakedly in with a different board composition.
Yeah. I want to make one other point. This isn't so much a feature of your arguments in the book, at least that I picked up, but I think it's an important consideration here. And it takes us to a broader set of concerns. So it has become harder in the United States to pursue a path towards upward mobility without getting a lot of credentials associated with licensure, but more often for many people, a collegiate degree. So, it used to be the case that if you were um, an able-bodied, high school educated man, it was more often men than women, coming out, you're 18, 19 years old, you finish high school, you're able-bodied, you have, you show up at work on time, you're willing to work hard, you could get a good job in manufacturing or construction or so on. Or you could start your own business. Maybe you're mowing lawns, um, trimming trees. You could turn into a landscaping business over time. There are many Americans who, in the early decades after World War II, built a path towards prosperity for themselves and their families without going to college. That path has become narrower and harder for many reasons, some which have to do with just shifts in the nature of available jobs, labor-saving technological innovations in agriculture and manufacturing. But another reason I think is we have foreclosed these paths where you kind of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Again, I gave the example. You start by mowing lawns when you're 16. You graduate from high school. You build this into a business over time. By the time you're 30, you're a landscaper and you've got, 5 or 10 people working for you. All of that becomes much harder because so many of these occupations in so many states are licensed. So we've just made it much harder to pursue a path towards upward mobility for people who don't kind of go the route you and I went. Okay, you and I, happen to have an aptitude set that suited higher education as a means of professional advancement. But not everybody's like that or wants to be like that. And we've made it a lot harder for those people, not just because of these structural changes in the economy, but also because of the policy decisions that we've made around things like occupational licensing. I just want to get your reaction to that.
Yeah, so this is one of the most interesting, I think, complicated parts of my book because so much of this story is true, and then there's also a counter story. So sticking with what you're saying first, think about what it takes to become a cosmetologist. So you're in the end, you're going to be cutting hair for a living. I don't know how much you're going to make, but it's going to be at best maybe $40,000 a year, probably less. What you have to do is you have to take an entire year out of the labor market. So you're earning zero. You are paying between $10,000 and $20,000 to as tuition to the beauty school. And you're probably doing this because you have a family you can live with. So you're living at home, maybe no low living expenses. And you're either going to pay with their money because they're going to pay for you, or you're putting on your credit card, which unfortunately I learned was a common way to pay for beauty schools. 10 to 20, now you're graduating with 10 to $20,000 of credit card debt into a profession that's going to earn you $40,000 a year. So, and this is all if you have a clean criminal record. That's another thing we haven't talked about, which is the way
Right.
in which criminal records and licensure interact to keep people out of the labor force, as you're talking about. So that makes it really uphill and impossible for many people, especially people who don't have wealthy-ish or at least, relatively flush families they can live with for a year. So that is a huge problem, and I totally agree with you. But it's also true that the professional license has become the picket fence. It has become the American dream. It has become the way that you are a member of the middle class. And especially the lower income professions like hair let go of that very unwillingly. They don't want to give up the professional status of licensure because that is making it, that is, achieving that toehold into the middle class. What I think gets lost in that set of arguments is that it's that because of the people it keeps out. It's really like yes, the people who have access to that kind of education can get ahead and can get that credential and then can use it to be a professional with a good income, but it really does that because it leaves behind so many people.
Right. Right. All righty. Thanks so much, Rebecca. This has been a great conversation. I hope here's my copy of your book.
Hey. Go out and buy
Go and
it.
buy it. I hope you get a big boost in your sales on Amazon and other platforms after this conversation.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care, Rebecca.
All right, bye.